Have you ever wondered what happens when the inflexible bureaucracy finds a force of nature that refuses to give in? Imagine being unfairly accused, your home invaded, and your way of life threatened by an anonymous and malicious denunciation. This is not just a story about a farmer and his animals. It is an electrifying tale about the confrontation between human arrogance and the indomitable power of the natural world. What would you do if government agents, convinced of your guilt, surpass all boundaries, ignoring your appeals and invading the sanctuary you spent your life building? The answer you're about to find out does not involve lawyers or legal arguments. It involves almost a ton of muscle fury, sharp horns, and an unforgettable lesson about respect and territory. Get ready for a story that will leave you at the tip of your chair, wondering how far you would protect everything you love. Keep reading to find out what happened when animal control has invaded and met the true kings of the farm. The morning sun had barely gilded the green fields of the farm when the shrill tire sound in the gravel broke the morning peace, a good omen of what was to come. I was on the porch, savoring my coffee, the steam dancing in the fresh air, my eyes traveling the family landscape that extended to where the view reached. It was my sanctuary, a refuge of tranquility, built with sweat and love over decades, a place where nature and I lived in harmony. The noise, so shifted in that idyllic scenario, made me frown. I left the cup on the wicker table and got up, feeling a node of apprehension to form in my stomach. Something was wrong. The sound was not from a neighbor coming to a friendly visit, nor from the postman with his weekly delivery. It was an official, impatient sound, loaded with an authority that did not belong to that place. And as I watched, a white vehicle with the county emblem stopped sharply in front of my gate. Uniformed men descended, their impassive faces and their efficient movements, and before I could sketch any reaction, they were forcing the entrance, the gate metal raging into protest. The invasion had begun. My legs took me forward almost by instinct, a protest forming on my lips even before I could articulate the words. "What do you think you are doing?" My voice sounded louder and firm than I expected, echoing from the stillness of the morning. They turned to me, their eyes devoid of any emotion, as if I were just another obstacle in their way. One of them, a bumpy man with a stubborn chin, stepped forward, holding a piece of paper like a shield. "Sir," he began, his condescending tone annoying me instantly, "we have an anonymous denunciation of animal abuse on this property. We have a warrant to inspect the facilities." His words hovered in the air, poisonous and absurd. Baluses? Here? Where was each animal treated with more care and respect than many people received in their lives? The accusation was so outrageous, so unfounded, that for a moment I was speechless. My animals were my family, my silent companions in this vast piece of land. The idea that someone could think the opposite was a stab in my heart. I looked at their faces, looking for a shred of understanding, of humanity, but I found nothing. They were automatons, fulfilling orders without question, regardless of the truth. The anger began to boil under my skin, a cold, controlled fury. "An anonymous denunciation?" I repeated, my voice now loaded with a sharp sarcasm. "And this gives them the right to invade my property, to violate my peace, to accuse me without the slightest proof?" The corpulent man simply shrugged, a gesture of indifference that further fed my wrath. "We are just doing our work, Lord," he said, as if it explained and justified everything. They began to spread across the ground, their heavy boots trampling the orbered grass, their eyes peeking each corner with a smug suspicion. I followed them, my body tense, every step of them a desecration of my home. They opened the barn, frightening the chickens, inspected the stable where my old mare slept peacefully, their already convinced minds of my fault. I knew who was behind it. My neighbor, a greedy man who had coveted my lands for years, who had already tried all the dirty tricks to force me to sell. This anonymous denunciation had the smell of his envy and evil. But proving it would be another battle, one that I would have to wage after dealing with this invasion. I tried to argue, tried to appeal to their common sense, explaining the daily routine of care, the love and dedication I dedicated to each creature under my responsibility. I showed them the premium ration bags, the fresh water and clean in each trough, the large space that each animal had to wander. But it was like talking to walls. They wrote down in their clipboards their skeptical expressions, as if all I said were an elaborate lie to cover heinous crimes. The impotence of the situation was overwhelming. Being judged and condemned without a fair judgment by strangers who knew nothing about me or my life. It was a deep violation, not just my property, but of my integrity, of my character. Every suspect look, every insinuating question was a blow to my soul. I, who always proud of my honesty and my ethical treatment with all life forms, was being treated like a criminal in my own home. The irony was bitter, a gas stove or gun in my mouth. And as they continued their futile search for non-existent evidence, an idea began to form in my mind. A dangerous idea, perhaps, but born of despair and the need to protect what was mine. The team leader, the same corpulent man, pointed to the farthest pasture, a surrounded area that I kept separated by a reason. "What's up? What's there?" he asked, his demanding tone. My eyes followed his finger, and a slow, dark smile began to form on my lips. "There?" I said, my voice now calm, almost fun. "That's where I keep my bulls." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, loaded with a weight that they did not yet understand. They looked at each other, a spark of uncertainty in their eyes for the first time. "Bulls?" one of the younger men repeated, as if testing the sound of the word. I nodded slowly, savoring the moment. "Yes, Lida bulls. Magnificent, but not very affected to strangers. Especially strangers who invade their territory without being invited." The truth was that my bulls were my passion. Creatures of immense strength and indomitable spirit, they were the pulsating heart of the farm. And they were fiercely protectors of their space. The idea of loosening those uniformed men in their pasture was both terrifying and strangely satisfying. It was a risky move, but they had pushed me into the limit. "We have to inspect all areas of property, sir," the leader insisted, his bravado starting to falter slightly. "It's the procedure." I shrugged, a gesture that mirrored his own previous indifference. "As you want. But I am not responsible for what happens inside. They are not pet ponies." I guided them to the gate of the pasture, a heavy wooden gate that seemed to contain a primordial force. One could feel the energy on the other side, a powerful and latent presence. The smell of earth and animal was stronger there, a wild and indomitable fragrance. I opened the heavy lock, the sound of the metal echoing in the tense silence. The gate opened with a creak, revealing the vast green extension, and, at a distance, the dark and muscular forms they pastured peacefully. "Feel comfortable," I said, taking a step back and weaving the way free. They hesitated, looking at me and then to the bulls, the confidence they previously displayed evaporating under the morning sun. The dynamics of power had changed. They were no longer in control, and deep dark part of me could barely wait to see what would happen next. The air became heavy with a palpable tension, while animal control men exchanged nervous glances, the initial arrogance replaced by a visible hesitation. The leader, trying to keep a facade of authority, straightened his shoulders and took a cautious step into the pasture. His colleagues followed him, moving with a slowness that betrayed his nervousness. I stayed by the gate, arms crossed, a silent observer of the drama that was about to unfold. The sound of his boots in the grass seemed abnormally high, an unholy intrusion in the sanctuary of my bulls. At first, the animals only raised their huge heads, their dark and smart eyes fixed on intruders. They were statues of muscle and power, the steam coming out of their nostrils in the fresh air of the morning. One of them, the largest and older, whom I called Hercules, released a low, deep buffet, a sound that vibrated down the floor and climbed the soles of my feet. It was a warning, a clear sign so they would no longer get closer. But men, arrested between duty and fear, continued their hesitant advance. They were in a territory they did not understand, facing a force they could not understand, and I knew Hercules' patience was running out quickly. The first movement was almost too subtle to notice. Hercules lowered his head, scraping the floor with one of his front hulls, raising small clouds of dust. His muscles contracted under the dark leather, a promise of contained violence. The other bulls began to move too, forming a silent semicircle, cornering men without them realizing. Panic began to settle in the faces of the officers. The man who held the clipboard dropped her, the sound of plastic hitting the floor sounding like a shot in the tense silence. "Lord," one of them called, his voice a trembling thread, "I think we've seen enough here." I just got up an eyebrow. "Oh yes? But you haven't inspected everything yet. I don't want you to say I haven't cooperated." Hercules released another buffo, this time louder, more aggressive. He stepped forward, then another, his imposing mass filling the field of vision of men. The leader began to slowly retreat, his hands raised in a gesture of appeasement. Okay, we're leaving," he said, his voice now a scared whisper. But it was too late. They had crossed a line, invaded a kingdom where they were not welcome, and now they would have to face the consequences. What followed was a controlled chaos, a terrifying dance of fear and fury. Hercules advanced, not with the total speed of an onslaught, but with a heavy and threatening trot that made the floor shake. Men shouted, abandoned professionalism in favor of pure panic. They turned and ran, a disordered and humiliating retreat. One of them stumbled and fell, rolling in the grass to avoid the approaching hooves. The leader, in his hurry to escape, was stuck at the gate, his uniform tearing into the metal as he squirmed to pass. The other bulls joined the persecution, not to hurt, but to expel, to reaffirm their mastery over the territory. It was a demonstration of primal power, an unforgettable lesson on respect and limits. And from my safe observation post, I watched everything, a whirlwind of emotions inside me. There was a dark satisfaction to see those arrogant men receive what they deserved, but there was also a genuine concern about the safety of all involved, both human and animals. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, but they had forced my hand. They had underestimated me and the indomitable spirit of the creatures I called family. And now they were paying the price. The stillness of the pasture was misleading, a thin veil over a latent energy that pulled under the green grass. Animal control men, now inside the surroundings, moved with a rigidity that betrayed their growing apprehension. They tried to maintain an air of professionalism, but their eyes fired nervously to the massive figures who grazed at a distance. Each leaves of leaves, each called a bird, seemed amplified in the suspended tension. I could see the sweat shining on the team's forehead, despite the freshness of the morning. He was out of his element, a bureaucrat used to dealing with scared stray dogs and cats, now confronted with tons of pure animal power. His movements were hesitant, a clumsy dance between the imposed duty and the instinct of self-preservation that shouted for him to retreat. He tried to speak, but the words seemed trapped in his throat, an inaudible croaker against imminent silence. The atmosphere was loaded, like air before a violent storm. The confrontation was inevitable, a collision of two worlds that should never have met. It was Hercules, my award-winning bull, the undisputed patriarch of the herd, who made the first movement. He was not just big. He was colossal, a mountain of defined muscles and a spirit forged in countless generations of pure blood. He raised his huge head, his long curved horn shining like a polished ivory in the sun. His dark and deep eyes, like wells, set in the intruders with a cold and evaluating intelligence. He was not a stupid animal moved only by instinct. There was a thought, a calculation in his gaze. He let out a low buffet, a guttural tremor that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It was a sound that spoke of ancestral power, unquestionable territorial rule. It was the first warning, an offer of mercy that men, in their ignorance, could not recognize. They continued their slow advance, their useless clipboards in their hands, their presence an affront to Hercules' sovereignty. The air got colder, the tension becoming a physical thing, a pressure against the chest. The patience of the king was running out. Then, with surprising fluidity for its size, Hercules began to move. It was not a blind onslaught, but a deliberate advance, each heavy step by stunning its hooves on the ground for a terrifying purpose. He lowered his head, featuring the impenetrable wall of his skull and the sharp tip of his horns. The soil trembled under its advance, and the sound of its heavy breathing filled the air. The other bulls, feeling the change in their leader's attitude, began to position themselves, flanking the scared men, cutting their escape routes. It was a hunting tactic, instinctive and perfectly performed. The men were now at the center of a potential death circle, their confidence evaporating like morning dew. Panic finally broke its control facade. His faces paled, his eyes widened in pure terror. They had made a monumental calculation error, underestimating the creature that now judged them. They came looking for a monster and found one, but it was not what they expected. The monster was real, magnificent, and terribly angry. The team leader stammered something unintelligible, taking a step back, a movement that Hercules interpreted as a challenge. The bull stopped, scraping the floor with the front hull, lifting ground and grass in a display of contained fury. The dust hanged in the air, capturing the sun's rays in a golden veil of imminent danger. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any roar. It was the silence of the decision, the moment before the attack. One could hear the tinnet of insects, the rapid heartbeat of men, the sound of the wind in the Hercules' horns. In this moment of terrifying clarity, men realized the depth of their error. They were not dealing with a domesticated farm animal. They were facing a force of nature, a personification of wild fury. Their rules, their regulations, their paper warrants meant nothing here. This was the kingdom of Hercules, and they were mere intrusion to their mercy. Perception hit them as a physical blow, stealing their breath and hope. They were completely and totally alone. One of the younger men, in an act of pure despair, turned and tried to run. It was the trigger. Hercules exploded in motion, an avalanche of flesh and bone driven by just fury. The earth moaned under its attack. He did not run to the man who fled, but to the center of the group, his clear intention, to disperse, terrorize, expel. The screams of the men were sharp and full of dread when they spread in all directions, their formation falling into a runaway membrane chaos. The leader, in his hurry, stumbled on his own feet, falling awkwardly on the grass. He turned in time to see the colossal mass of Hercules passing through him, the wind of his passage whipping his face. The bull did not play it, an act of containment that was even more terrifying in its implication. He could have ended him with a single movement, but he chose not to do so. It was a demonstration of power, a warning of what he was capable. The message was clear: they leave now, or they will not come out at all. The withdrawal was a humiliating confusion. The men ran to the gate, climbing it with agility born of deadly fear. Uniforms were torn, dignity was abandoned. They didn't look back. The sound of his screams and his disordered escape was a strange song for my ears, a symphony of poetic justice. Hercules stopped in the center of the pasture, his chest panting, the steam coming out of his nostrils like a furnace smoke. He lifted his head and let out a triumphant meot, a sound that echoed through the valleys and hills, proclaiming his victory and reaffirming his dominion. The other bulls joined him, a choir of brute power that celebrated the expulsion of the invaders. They had defended their home, protected their sanctuary. They had faced human arrogance and had defeated it. I closed the heavy gate, the sound of the lock fitting sealing the end of the confrontation. I looked at my bulls, my magnificent guardians, and felt a wave of pride and gratitude invade me. They were more than just animals. They were the living and pulsating spirit of this earth. The men huddled themselves outside the gate, panting and naked, their pale, shocked faces. The leader supported himself in the vehicle, trying to recover his breath and a shred of his lost authority. He looked at me, his eyes a mixture of anger, fear, and reluctant respect. "You're crazy," he gasped, the words coming out with difficulty. I just smiled, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "No, sir," I answered calmly. "I just respect the limits, something you should learn to do." He had no answer. He knew I was right. They had exceeded a limit, ignored the warnings, and paid the price for their arrogance. The anonymous denunciation, the warrant, all seemed insignificant now in the face of the primal reality they have just faced. They came with the power of the law, but were repelled by the power of nature. They turned and entered the vehicle, their doors knocking on a defeated purpose. Silence has settled again on the farm, but it was a different silence now. It was a victorious silence. While the animal control vehicle disappeared into a cloud of dust, I turned to the pasture. Hercules was still there watching me, his dark eyes seeming to understand everything. I approached the gate and extended my hand, a gesture of respect and gratitude. He approached slowly, his huge body moving with an unexpected grace. He leaned his massive head in the fence, allowing me to caress his muzzle. There was an understanding between us, a bond forged not in words, but in mutual respect and a love shared by that land. He had protected me, defended our home, and I would never forget that. At that moment he was not just a bull, he was a hero, a king in his castle. The tranquility of the farm had been violated, but had also been defended. And while the afternoon sun was starting down the horizon, painting the sky with orange and purple, I knew that as Hercules and his brothers were in guard, our sanctuary would remain safe. The lesson of that day was set to fire in the memory of all involved. For animal control men, it was a lesson on humility and the dangers of underestimating the natural world. For me, it was a reminder of the power and majesty of the creatures I shared my life with. And to my greedy neighbor, who would undoubtedly hear the story, it would be a clear warning that there was strength on my farm that he could not expect to defeat with dirty tricks and false denunciations. The news of the meeting would spread across the community, becoming a kind of local legend, a warning tale for those who dare to disturb the old farmer's peace and his bulls. And I didn't care. May they speak. That they fear. Because they had learned the hard way that my home, my land, and my animals were protected not only by fences and gates, but by an indomitable spirit that would not bow to anyone. The silent fury of an owner, when awakened, could be as formidable as the onslaught of a bull. Panic was a spark that turned into a fire. By the time Hercules made his first threatening onslaught, the thin layer of professional courage that animal control men dressed completely disintegrated. What followed was not a strategic withdrawal, but a chaotic escape desperate for survival. Aguded shouts pierced the air, replacing the bureaucratic jargon of moments before. The vision of almost a ton of muscle fury coming toward him erased all thoughts about procedures and warrants. The only thing in their minds was the distance that separated them from the gate and the terrifying speed that this distance was decreasing. It was the personification of the nightmare, a monster out of an old myth, and they were trapped in their domain. The ground was vibrated with each bull's step, a war drum that announced his discontent. The smell of crushed grass and adrenaline filled the air, a powerful cocktail of nature and fear. Their world had been reduced to one goal: to escape. The race to the gate was a show of dark comedy and genuine terror. A man, the youngest in the group, stumbled into a hidden tree root, falling into the damp earth. He rolled frantically, his wide-eyed eyes, while the shadow of Hercules passed him like a cargo train. The bull ignored him, his attention focused on expelling the collective threat, not in a single individual. But for the man on the ground, that brief moment must have seemed eternity, the expectation of pain and impact hanging on him as a death sentence. Another officer, in his hurry, tried to climb the surrounding the gate, just to have his uniform hooked on the barbed wire, hanging him in a humiliating and precarious position. His cries of help mingled with the curse of his colleagues on the run, creating a panic cacophony. The law, so imposing and sure of itself moments before, was now in a complete stampede, defeated not by legal arguments, but by the brute and primal force of nature. The team leader, who had set the pasture entry, was the last to reach the gate, his breathless breath in large gulps. He threw himself against the solid wood, fighting with the handy lock. For a terrible second, the lock stuck, and the look of pure terror on her face was something I wouldn't forget anytime soon. He looked over his shoulder, seeing the other bulls approaching, a wall of horns and muscles. Finally, with a last desperate tug, the lock gave in, and he squeezed by the opening, falling on the other side in a clumsy pile of lost dignity. He dragged himself away from the gate, his pale, stained face of dirt, his torn uniform, and his authority in shakes. He and his men gathered near his vehicle, a group of defeated, panting, and tremendous conquerors, throwing scared glances at the pasture that almost became his tomb. They had caused the sleeping giant and barely escaped his wrath. The lesson was hard, but unforgettable. I approached the group, my face a mask of calculated calm. "I think the inspection is over," I said, my voice dripping with an irony that did not go unnoticed. The leader shot me with his eyes, a mixture of powerless fury and residual fear. You are completely irresponsible," he spat, trying to recover some sense of control. "These animals are dangerous. They should be slaughtered." I laugh, a low and humorous sound. Dangerous? I repeated. They were grazing peacefully in their own home until strangers, armed with an arrogant attitude, decided to invade their space. Who do you think was the aggressor here? He opened his mouth to answer, but no word came out. He had no argument. Deep down, he knew I was right. They had been the instigators, the provocative. The bulls only reacted how any creature would do when they had their sanctuary violated. They had acted by instinct, an instinct of protection that men, in their presumption, had ignored. The law may be on their side on paper, but the law of nature had prevailed in the countryside. Consider this a lesson on jurisdiction, I continued, my tone becoming more serious. You have authority on the streets and cities, but here, on this earth, there are older laws, laws of respect, territory, laws that my bulls understand perfectly. You came here with suspicion and disrespect, and almost paid a very high price for it. Each word seemed to hit them, disarming their anger and replacing it with a dark understanding. They looked at each other, the blame and embarrassment evident in their faces. The anonymous denunciation, the assumption of abuse, everything seemed ridiculous now. They had witnessed the bond between me and my animals firsthand, a bond based not on cruelty but in a deep, mutual respect. They had seen the indomitable spirit of creatures that were loved and well cared for, creatures that would defend their home with a ferocity that no cage or chain could contain. The truth was there, grazing calmly across the gate, and it was undeniable. Without saying another word, they turned and entered their vehicle. The doors closed with a muffled sound, sealing their defeat. I watched them leave, the white vehicle raising a cloud of dust as it walked away from the gravel road, a shameful removal from the battlefield. The silence that followed was deep and satisfactory. Peace had returned to my farm, a peace conquered and defended. I stayed there for a long time, just listening to the family sounds of nature, the bird's corner, the buzz of the bees, the smooth rustle from the grass to the wind. I turned to the pasture, where Hercules and the others had resumed their quiet grazing, as if nothing had happened, but something had happened. A line had been drawn in the sand, a statement had been made. My farm was my castle, and my bulls were his loyal guardians. Anyone who dared to challenge this in the future would do it at your own risk. The law may have fled with the tail between the legs that day, but justice had been served. Later that night, while the moon climbed over the silent fields, I received a call. He was the head of the Animal Control Department, the superior of the man who led the team. His voice was apologetic, embarrassed. He had received his men's report, a report without a doubt mitigated, but he could not hide the essence of what had happened. He apologized for the invasion, the unfounded accusation. He assured me that the matter was closed and that there would be no more problems. He also mentioned that the anonymous denunciation had been tracked to a prepaid phone bought in the neighboring city, a dead end, but we all knew where it really came from. My neighbor couldn't get what I wanted so easily. His attempt to use the system against me had failed spectacularly, thanks to the unexpected intervention of my four-legged protectors. I accepted the apology with a cold grace, knowing that the victory was mine. The incident became a local legend. The story of the day when animal control faced the old farmer's bulls was told and retold in cafes and bars, growing and embellishing each narration. I became a kind of popular hero, a man who defended his land and his animals against government intrusion. And my bulls, especially Hercules, have become mythical figures, beasts of amazing strength and intelligence. The reputation had a beneficial effect. The hunters stopped breaking my lands. The teenagers stopped making mischief near my fences. My property gained an aura of inviolability, a sanctuary protected by formidable guardians. I didn't ask for this notoriety, but I accepted it as a welcome byproduct of the defense of my way of life. The following peace was the greatest reward of all. And so, life on the farm returned to its quiet pace. The days passed a hard work succession and simple satisfaction. But whenever I looked at the pasture and saw Hercules standing, proud and vigilant, I remembered that day. The day when human arrogance collided with the fury of nature. The day the law was forced to a humiliating stampede. It was a reminder that the most important things in life, home, family, loyalty, are worth defended with everything we have. And sometimes the best advocates do not wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they have 4 legs, a pair of sharp horns, and a heart as wild and indomitable as the land they call home. And so I would be forever grateful. The root of the whole conflict was not in my pastures or barns, but on the neighboring property, where the grass was not more green, but tinged by envy. My neighbor, a man named Silas, was the embodiment of greed. He was a real estate developer with shark eyes and a soul devoid of any appreciation for the earth other than his monetary value. He saw my farm not as a sanctuary of life and tranquility, but as an obstacle to his next luxury condominium. For years, he bothered me with offers, each more insulting than the previous one, all which I refused firmly. He could not understand why someone would choose the smell of hay and earth over the smell of new money. My refusal to sell was a personal affront to him, a challenge to his worldview where everything and everyone had a price. Its frustration became a latent hostility, a cold war locked through fences and soslayo looks. I could feel your resentment growing every season, like a poisonous weed spreading along the property line. Silas' tactics began subtly. Small transgressions, such as accidentally letting their cattle graze on my lands or dispute border landmarks that had been established for generations. Each incident was a test, a provocation designed to wear out, to make my life here so unpleasant that I would finally give in and sell. I dealt with each of them with tired patience, fixing fences, gathering their cattle, and sending him firm but polite letters from my lawyers. I didn't want an open war, but it wouldn't retreat an inch either. This land was in the blood of my family, passed from my grandfather to my father and to me. Each tree, every stream, every piece of soil contained memories and a legacy that no check could buy. Silas, with his rapid profit mindset and predatory development, could never understand the value of what he was trying to destroy. He saw acres. I saw history. He saw profit potential. I saw a way of life. Our worlds were fundamentally incompatible. When his low-intensity tactics failed to shake me, he became bolder. I started to find trash Dr. Armungensleiner, Arakia's petty disrespect. His construction workers, building our adjacent ground, conveniently lost themselves and opened an improvised roads through my fields, causing damage to plantations. Each time, I documented the damage, registered a report, and sent the bill to him, which he paid with a reluctant growl. It was a tiring cat and rat game, a resistance test. He expected me to get tired, that the cost and discomfort of fighting him would break me. But he underestimated my stubbornness and my deep love for this earth. Each of his attacks only strengthened my resolution. I was not just fighting for a property. I was fighting for my identity, the soul of my inheritance. The farm was an extension of myself, and I would defend it with the same ferocity with which I would defend my own body. The denunciation of animal control was his most sinister climb, a low blow designed to reach where he would hurt the most. He knew of my love for my animals, my reputation as a careful and ethical creator. Accusing myself of abuse was an attempt to stain my name, to use state power as a weapon against me. The anonymous nature of the complaint was its cowardly signature. he did not have the courage to face me directly, preferring to hide in the shadows and pull the ropes of bureaucracy. He probably imagined the scenario in his greedy mind. The officers would find some small infraction, I would be fined or my animals would be confiscated, and the shame and the legal cost would force me to sell. It was a devilish plan, but, like most of its plans, it was flawed because it was based on a false premise. He assumed that I had something to hide, that there was some truth in his lie. He didn't count on the truth being my greatest defense. After the incident with animal control and its humiliating withdrawal, a strange silence descended over the fence line. Silas no longer made contact attempts. Their construction workers remained strictly on their property. The trash stopped appearing. It was as if the stampede story had come to his ears, and I had no doubt that yes, and gave him a break to think. He may have realized that he had aroused something he could not control. He tried to use the law as a club and failed. Now he was confronted with the reality that there were other forces at stake, forces that could not be intimidated or purchased. My bulls, in their fair fury, had become my unexpected executors, sending a clearer message than any lawyer letter could. The message was simple: stay away. This land is protected. I knew the battle was not over, but an uncomfortable truce had been declared. Silas was undoubtedly licking his wounds and planning his next move. Men like him do not give up easily. His greed was a hunger that could never be satiated. But something had changed. I no longer felt like the victim in his game. The incident with animal control, though stressful, had strengthened me. He showed me that I was not alone in this fight. I had allies, allies of almost a ton with sharp horns and a strong sense of territorial justice. I had won this round and defeated decisively. The scale of power had leaned, even slightly, in my favor. He now knew that I was not an easy target, that fighting with me would have unexpected and unpleasant consequences. Uncertainty was now on your side. I continued my life, always vigilant, always aware of the threat on the other side of the fence. I installed security cameras along my property line, not out of fear, but as a prudent precaution. I deculted everything, keeping a meticulous record of every little thing, building a case against him if necessary in the future. I would not be taken by surprise again. The innocence I have already had about the nature of my neighbors was replaced by a realism hardened by battle. The world was a beautiful place, but it also contained darkness and greed, and it was foolish to ignore this reality. My farm was my paradise, but even paradise needs a guard angel with a flame sword, or, in my case, a bull with a bad temperament. Peace had to be watched. Tranquility had to be defended. Months turned into a year, and Silas's silence continued. I heard rumors in the city that his condominium project was facing financial problems, that he had extended too much. A small part of me felt a twinge of schadenfreude, the poetic justice of seeing his greed to turn against him. But mostly, I felt relief. Perhaps he had finally encountered greater problems to deal with than an old stubborn farmer. Maybe he had realized that some things are not for sale. Whatever the reason, the pressure had diminished, and life on the farm had become more peaceful than it had been in years. I could breathe a little easier, knowing that, for now, the threat had retreated. In the end, the Silas saga was a lesson about the value of things that cannot be measured in cash. He taught me about the ugliness of human greed, but also reminded me of the beauty of loyalty and the strength of the spirit. He tried to get my house out, but when he did so, he just made her more precious to me. He tried to break my spirit, but only strengthened him. And, ironically, by sending men from the law to torment me, he gave me the opportunity to witness the unshakable loyalty of my animals and forge a legend that would protect my land for years. Silas, the unwanted neighbor, in his attempt to be my greatest enemy, had become my involuntary benefactor. And that was an irony that I would taste for a long time. The story of the confrontation was not contained within the limits of my farm. As seeds carried by the wind, she spread throughout the countryside, flourishing in a local legend that assumed her own life. At community dinners, ration stores, and dusty bars where farmers gathered after a long day, the story was told with growing admiration and ornament. Animal control men, once seen as figures of authority, became the protagonists of a comic fable. Bureaucrats of the city who had a harsh lesson on the realities of life in the countryside. His hasty and dishalted withdrawal was described in hilarious details, each narration adding a new to his defeat. They became a warning tale, an example of what happens when the arrogance of the city collides with the wisdom of the earth. The incident served as a great equalizer, reminding everyone that power does not always reside in uniforms and regulations. In contrast, my bulls and I were elevated to an almost mythical status. I was transformed from a simple, secluded farmer into a stubborn guardian of tradition, a man who lived in harmony with nature and would defend it with a silent determination. But the real stars of the legend were the bulls. Hercules, in particular, became a figure of admiration and astonishment. He was no longer just an animal of creation. He was the king of pasture, a noble protector of incredible strength and intelligence. People spoke of him with the same respect that they could reserve for a human hero. The stories described his attack not as an act of blind aggression, but as a calculated defense of his kingdom, a demonstration of loyalty to his owner and his home. The bulls have become symbols of the earth itself, strong, indomitable, and fiercely protective of those who respect them. They were the embodiment of the independent spirit that defined our rural community. This new legacy had tangible and beneficial consequences for me and the farm. The inviolability aura that now surrounded my property was more effective than any fence or a forbidden to overcome sign. The smaller problems that once tormented me simply disappeared. The opportunistic hunters who used to cut my fences to pursue deer now gave my land ample space. Local teenagers, who once saw my distant fields as a place for parties and bonfires, now told ghost stories about the guardian bulls that patrolled the night. The peace and privacy I valued so much were restored, not through threats or confrontations, but by the power of folklore. The reputation of my farm protected her. It was as if Hercules and his brothers had extended their dominion beyond the pasture, throwing a protective cloak over the entire property. The story also changed the dynamics between me and the rest of the community. Before, I was seen as a little eccentric, a man who preferred the company of animals to that of people. But now, there was a new level of respect in your eyes. Other farmers came to see me, not just to buy cattle, but to ask for advice, to talk about the land, to share stories. They saw me as one of themselves, an advocate of their way of life against the invasive pressures of the modern world. The incident had forged a bond, a solidarity. I reluctantly became a pillar of the community, a symbol of resistance and integrity. It was a role that I never sought, but I accepted with a sense of responsibility. I had defended my own farm, but in doing so, it seemed to have defended something larger, a set of values that we all preached. The legacy also had a deep effect on my relationship with the animals themselves. I always loved them and respected them, but after that day, my appreciation deepened something close to reverence. I looked at Hercules not only as a valuable asset or a beautiful specimen, but as a partner, a confederate. There was a tacit understanding among us, a recognition of our covenant. I would take care of him, guarantee his well-being and comfort, and he, in turn, would watch our shared home. This bond extended to the whole herd. I spent more time with them, not only doing the tasks, but simply existing in their presence, observing their complex social interactions, admiring their silent power. They taught me more about loyalty, courage, and dignity than any human being could ever. They were my teachers, my protectors, my family. Over time, I began to actively embrace the legacy. When people came to the farm, I did not move them away from history. I shared her, not to brag, but to honor the true heroes of that day. I took them to see the bulls, presenting Hercules with the pride of a father. I wanted people to see themselves that these were not monsters, but magnificent creatures that deserved respect. I used the notoriety to educate people about animal ethical creation, about the importance of understanding and coexisting with the natural world. History has become a parable, a teaching tool. Silas attempted to hurt me, ironically, gave me a platform to promote the very things I valued most. The darkness he tried to bring to my life was transformed into a light that shone far beyond my gates. The legacy of the guardian bulls also served as a permanent warning to Silas, and for anyone like him. The story has ensured that his coward attempt was never forgotten. He became part of his own reputation in the community, the stain on his behalf. Whenever he tried to start a new project or gain people's confidence, the history of bulls rises, a reminder of their character. He wanted to use the system to crush a man, but instead, the history of man and his animals had neutralized him. It was the form of the community of policing itself, of using the narrative to reinforce morality and punish transgression. Justice, it seems, is not always found in a court. Sometimes it is found in the stories we tell each other, in the legacies we create and defend. Years later, when I was already a much older man, the story still endured. The children who heard her from her parents now told her to her own children. Hercules had been left for a long time, just like many of the other bulls of that day. But his descendants wandered through the same pastures, carrying the same proud blood and indomitable spirit. The legacy was now theirs to carry. And I knew as I looked at the fields of my porch that the farm would be safe. She was protected not only by wire fences and wooden gates, but for a powerful story, a legend of loyal guardians who rose to defend their home. The legacy of the bulls was now as part of this land as the soil itself, an eternal promise that this sanctuary would never fall. And so, what began as a day of conflict and fear became a lasting heritage of strength and pride. It was a testimony of the fact that sometimes the darker events can give rise to the brighter light. A man's attempt to destroy my world resulted in his fortification in ways I could never have imagined. The fury of a bull has become the peace of a community. The legacy of the guardian bulls was not just about a confrontation in a pasture. It was about the resilience of the spirit, the power of loyalty, and the lasting truth that a home defended with love is an impenetrable fortress. And that was an inheritance that it was worth fighting. After the humiliating departure of the animal control vehicle, a deep and resonant silence descended over the farm. It was not just the absence of sound, but the absence of conflict, the dissipation of a tension that had infiltrated every corner of my property. The air looked cleaner, the warmer sunlight. It was as if the land itself was exhaling a sigh of relief. I leaned against the gate of the pasture, my body finally relaxing after hours of tension. Across the fence, Hercules and his brothers had calmed down. his massive bodies moving with restored tranquility as they ripped tufts of grass. The storm had passed. The invasion had been repelled. Peace, a peace that I had given for certain for so long, had been violently torn from me, and now gloriously reconquered. And at that moment, she looked more precious than ever. In the following days, I moved by the farm with a new sense of purpose and gratitude. Each task, from fixing a section of fence to fill the tricks with water, seemed less one task and another act of love, a reaffirmation of my commitment to that place. The incident had served as a brutal reminder of how quickly the world I had built could be threatened. This forced me to look at my life with new eyes, to appreciate the simple joys that often went unnoticed, the sound of calves calling their mothers, the sensation of the morning sun on my face, the vision of my fields extending green and exuberant to the horizon. It was these little things that constituted the tapestry of my life, the essence of peace I would fight to protect. The threat of losing her had made her infinitely sweeter. The news of what happened spread, and with it came an unexpected wave of community support. Neighbors I barely knew stopped to offer a word of encouragement. The owner of the feed store gave me a firm hand grip and a bag of treats for the bulls on behalf of the house. People saw me not like a victim, but as a winner, someone who had faced bureaucracy and intimidation and out. This solidarity was a balm for the wound left by the unfounded accusation, restored my faith in the decency of the ordinary people, a necessary counterweight to the malice of my neighbor Silas. I realized that although I could live a secluded life, I was not truly alone. I was part of a community united by shared values of independence, hard work, and respect for the land. Reconquered peace was not just mine, belonged to all of us. Silas's absence of hostility was the most tangible part of the new peace. The silence on the other side of the fence was a blessing. There was no more garbage to clean, no fences to fix, no petty taunts to support. It was as if a chronic source of pain and irritation had been removed from my life. I could work on my fields without constantly looking over my shoulder, without the uncomfortable feeling of being observed and judged. The mental tranquility this provided me was immense. The Cold War was over, and I had been the unquestionable winner, not through aggression, but through the firm defense of my territory and the unexpected intervention of my formidable allies. Peace had not been negotiated or committed. It had been imposed by the undeniable reality that my farm was a more formidable fortress than he imagined. With external peace came a deeper inner peace. The confrontation forced me to confront my own limits and my own strength. I discovered a reserve of resilience in me that I didn't know I had. I had faced the authority, the accusation, and the threat of loss, and had not faltered. This perception gave me a new confidence, an inner calm that permeated everything I did. I was no longer just the caretaker of this land. I was your defender. This sense of identity was strengthening. The peace I felt was not passive, the absence of problems, but active, a state of being that I had achieved and now would actively maintain. It was the peace of a warrior at rest, vigilant and ready, but finally at rest. The relationship with my animals became the central piece of this reconquested peace. They were the living proof that I was doing something right. His health, his vitality, his indomitable spirit were the final testimony against Silas's lies. Spending time with them became my therapy, my sanctuary. Observing the bulls in their pasture, their powerful but peaceful presence was a constant reminder of the source of my strength. They had risked me, defended our home. The bond between us was sealed over fire and fear and emerged stronger than steel. They were not just cattle. They were my comrades. His peace was my peace. As long as they were happy, grazing under the open, so would I be too. Their tranquility was the barometer of my own well-being. The farm itself seemed to flourish in this new atmosphere of tranquility. The harvests seemed greener, the healthiest cattle, the most abundant wildlife. Maybe it was just my imagination, my own inner peace projecting itself in the world around me. Or maybe there was something else in it. Perhaps the absence of stress and conflict had a real and tangible effect, allowing the energy of the earth to express itself more fully. Whatever the case, the farm became one more paradise than ever. It was a self-sufficient ecosystem of peace, a separate world protected from the storms of the outside world by fences, legends, and the memory of a furious bull. It was my masterpiece, the work of my life, and was finally complete and safe. Time has passed, and peace remained. It became the new normal. The incident with animal control retreated to memory, becoming a vivid trauma into a story told, a battle scar that resembled a victory won with difficulty. I looked back not angry or fear, but with a strange sense of gratitude. The challenge made me stronger. The threat made me more vigilant, and the fight brought me a deeper appreciation for everything I had. The following piece was not a return to the status quo, but a rise to a new level of existence. It was a forged, tested, and true peace. A peace that had been conquered with the help of unexpected allies, and that I would keep for the rest of my days. And so, in the golden years of my life, I found a contentment that few men know. Surrounded by the beauty of nature, the loyalty of my animals, and the respect of my community, I lived my days in a conquered tranquility. The farm was not just a piece of land, it was a living testimony of the power of resilience, a peace monument that can be found when defending what one loves. And every night, when the sun was over my silent fields, I thanked the land for the animals and even for the conflict that taught me the true value of peace. Reconquered peace was the richest harvest of all, a final reward for a life lived with integrity and courage.